Okay, great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I think we're ready to get started with our May 14th Grand Rounds. And I'm very excited today because we have storytelling in medicine and lessons from the pandemic. Megan Lemay, who's assistant professor in general internal medicine, is going to lead this Grand Rounds. She specializes in medical storytelling. And importantly, not only has she got great clinical acumen, but she is a fierce competitor for our internal medicine Idol of the Week. So we wish her luck in the upcoming competition. We're also really privileged today to have Dr. Richard Wenzel with us. Dr. Wenzel, as you know, I'm sure was the Department of Medicine chairman and also was a leader for the Medical College of Senior Physicians group. You know, he's an intellectual giant in infectious disease, epidemiology, incredibly well respected around the world for his work, very broadly published, and has done some of the things that we'd all love to do. He's been an editor at the New England Journal of Medicine. He's a fantastic teacher, was named in 2001 as the 10 great teachers by the National Institutes of Health. And in addition to his teaching prowess, he's just made a really important scientific advances. So we're just really privileged to have had you all these years in our health system, and just delighted as an epidemiologist that you can be here today to lead us through these Grand Rounds. Rose Baumann is one of our third-year residents who received her training in Blacksburg, Virginia, and started a residency here back in 2017. And David Goldberg is one of our assistant clinical professors and a very busy clinical hospitalist who was trained here at VCU and does a lot of important teaching in the medical school as well as in the clinics. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, we have Mr. Johnnie Harris, who is a VCU patient and is going to help us with our storytelling today. And a special thanks to you for spending time with us today, and we really look forward to your thoughts. And I think Megan is going to do a little bit more of an introduction for him. So look forward to this Grand Round. Thank you all for the incredible work you continue to do, taking care of all of our patients in the hospitals and the clinics with COVID and without. And with that, we'll get going.
Hi, everyone. I am really excited to be here today to talk to you guys. Well, really not talk to you, but really share stories with all of you. I think this is our third storytelling Grand Rounds that we've done, and it doesn't feel quite the same with only a handful of people in the room. So I really look forward to a day when we all get to be back in this room together. Today we're going to discuss the importance of stories in communication and learning, understand the role that stories play in the current pandemic, and really we're only going to spend a few minutes on the first two objectives, but then we're really going to spend the majority of our time listening to the personal impact that the pandemic has from multiple different perspectives. So you all are, I'm guessing, fully aware of the current situation, the global pandemic. The United States of America just lit up like a Christmas tree. But I want to examine the role that stories have in the current pandemic and how the sharing of information has changed in the current pandemic. So this is a little case study that I think may illustrate that. So back on March 20th, there was a paper published in the International Journal of Antimicrobial Agents about hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin as potential treatment for COVID-19. And they had 26 patients who received the treatment, and the endpoint of their study was clearance of COVID-19 from nasal passages. And just after that, we had that information shared to the lay public with words like, "It's worked unbelievably," and "What do you have to lose?" And then shortly after that, within 5 days, a man died, and his wife was in critical care after ingesting chloroquine meant for fish tanks. So something has gone wrong here in the sharing of information. There's something askew with the way that we have shared this information, the way that we view risk, and the way we make our decisions. So everyone in all of these pictures is fully aware of that first picture I showed of the global pandemic And yet still we have people, despite the growing numbers of people affected by COVID-19 and dying of COVID-19, we have more and more people out in public, even though the risk may be higher and the consequence is greater. So I've been thinking a lot about why that is. Even though there's more cases and our risk is higher, why are people less apt to be following the advice for social distancing and all the other medical advice that people have given the country right now? This is actually a quote from Joseph Stalin, who said, "The death of one man is a tragedy. The death of millions is a statistic." So I delved a little bit further into that idea and investigating the way we're making our decisions and viewing risk right now. I came across this article published back in 2009 from Shankar Vedantam, who is, many of you may know from his work on NPR. I'm his total fangirl. But he talked about the work of Dr. Paul Slovic, who's a professor at the University of Oregon. And I have just touched the tip of the iceberg of some of this man's work, and I find it totally fascinating. And I encourage you all to think about reading a little bit about it after this. But I just want to share a little bit about what Dr. Slovic does in his work in decision-making and risk. So he views this topic called psychic numbing, which is that as the number of victims in a tragedy increases, our empathy or willingness to help decreases. So you can see here in A, this is sort of across the X, we have number of lives, and up on Y, we have the value of life saving. And in A, you can see what we might think, that each life has equal value. As you increase the number of lives, you increase the number of value predictably. Where you may think, well, if there are more and more lives being lost, it becomes logarithmically more important, the value of those lives. And that may be what you think now. Now we have not just one person dead from coronavirus, but over 80,000. It should be just that much more important. Or maybe it is more important, but it eventually reaches a plateau of how important it may be to us. But what Dr. Slovic actually finds in his research is that the value of life-saving actually decreases predictably the more number of lives that are at risk. And he finds that after just one person, the risk decreases. And he believes that may be because somewhere deep in our psyche, we have some sort of separation between what we view as an individual and what we view as a group. And we place higher value on the individual, and it's hard for us to attain a concept of that losing more and more lives or losing a group. And that we feel a sense of inefficacy when more and more and more lives are being lost. We sort of become apathetic to that. He was part of this study where they asked volunteers about two different Rwandan refugee camps. This is all theoretical. And one camp had 11,000 people, and one camp had 25,000 people. And there were certain resources that you could allocate to either group. And one of those resources was water that would save the lives of 4,500 people. So one group of participants was told 4,500 lives saved out of the group of 11,000. And the other group said there would be 45,000 lives saved. 4,500, I'm sorry, it's 4,500 in each, 4,500 saved out of the group of 250,000. And people were actually more likely to allocate resources to the smaller group of 11,000 rather than the larger group of 250,000, even though it would save the same number of people in each. The psychic numbing is sort of paired with this idea called the singularity effect, which is the idea that we really value a single life very greatly. And he sort of breaks it down in a way that I found helpful to think about. The first loss of life, or one life lost, is precious. but we don't really think of a difference. You don't feel worse about 88,201 lives versus 88,202 lives, even though it's still just one life different between those two. So he was part of another study where he asked volunteers whether they would help raise $300,000 to save the lives of 8 children dying of cancer. And then another group was asked if they would raise this money to save the life of 1 child who was dying of cancer. And as you can see, people were more likely to give money to the 1 child rather than the 8 children. This singularity effect, I think, was also really visible in this case. This is a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old. The little boy in the yellow is a boy named Alan Kurdi, who in 2015 left Syria to try to escape the war there, and unfortunately was drowned along with his brother and mother on the voyage. I'm not going to show the picture that you may be more familiar with, which is the boy in the red shirt who washed ashore on the beach of Turkey. But the day after that, his photo washed upon the shore was shared. It increased the amount of giving to Syrian refugees by 55 times. Whereas all along, thousands upon thousands of lives were being lost. This one singular life that we could visualize made such a difference in how people were viewing a mass tragedy. Ken Burns said, history is mostly story. And I really think that holds true. Right now, at a time when more and more people are dying and we are facing a greater and greater burden of this disease, I think the power of stories is that sharing an individual experience has a bigger impact on somebody than sharing the experience of thousands and thousands or millions and millions. So I hope I've convinced you that the value of story right now is of great importance. And I'm really honored today to have Mr. Johnnie Harris join us. Mr. Harris was a patient of ours at VCU Medical Center this spring for 29 days as he battled with COVID-19. And he's very, very graciously agreed to come talk with us today about his personal experience and the personal impact it's had on him. So with that, I will have Chris, I guess, turn it over to Mr. Harris.
Hi, how are you doing today? Good afternoon. Just a little history of my situation. I was actually on vacation and I was at home, so it was a stay-at-home vacation. I started off the first 2 days with some headaches. Thought it was just common. Then maybe the 3rd day, I started getting some fevers, weaknesses, sweating, tiredness, exhaustion. And my wife, keep in mind, she's a nurse as well. She decided to take me to our primary care to get tested for COVID. At the time, the COVID test took about 3, maybe 5 days, 5 business days before it came back. And then I started getting worse and worse. So my primary care said, hey, why don't you just go to St. Francis? I live in the Midlothian area. St. Francis would not test me again for COVID. So they, without any testing, they just said I had pneumonia. Things just kept getting worse and worse and worse. So we decided to go to VCU. During the process of being in the hospital at VCU, it was determined I had a double pneumonia with COVID, which is, from my understanding, was pretty extreme. So they had to intubate me. And during that process, every organ that I have failed, and it failed horribly. Eventually, after being 16 days intubated, I got better. It took me a while to get things together overall, but I got better. Thankful to the doctors and the nurses that assisted with that. Probably about the 18th day, they moved me down to a regular floor, and that's when I started doing, basic therapy, speech therapy, walking, uh, hand movements, with my occupational therapist and my physical therapist. Um, After that, I came home. I stayed about another week and a half in the hospital, and I came home to do the remaining of my physical therapy. Um, Post-COVID things that I go through right now, I do have a lot of exhaustion. Um, and that's something I'm working on, but that's only with time because of what this virus does to your body. You're always tired. You don't want to get out of bed. Um, on top of that, learning how to walk again, uh, it takes a toll on you too. You didn't know. Well, I never realized how much muscles I use walking and breathing all at the same time. But I've came a long way. I started walking on, I think it was the 20, I want to say the 23rd when I took my first step. Now I can probably walk up to a mile with normal breathing without too much exhaustion. So I'm thankful for that. I'm thankful for everything the doctors have done for me. And that's pretty much the gist. I wish I could tell you everything I went through during the part I was under. Um, but I know the doctors can tell you that helped me out. And that's pretty much my story for the most part. How's it affected me life-wise? Um, I think the walking, I think sometimes I feel like, and I don't get this too often, maybe once a week, I feel like anxiety kicks in a little bit just from being in the hospital, laying on a bed for 28, 29 days. That kicks in a little bit. But again, thankful I have a wonderful wife that's a nurse that actually helps me get out of it and get back to a more normal day. But it's a long process, but I'm always willing to work. Sometimes I say, my wife says it, my family says it, that I try to overdo it. And I realize I can't do that. I got to let my body take its course to get better and heal as fast as it can. And that's my story for this thing.
Thank you so much, Mr. Harris. You would be hearing a loud room of applause under normal circumstances. I just wanted to ask you, if there was one thing you would really want your treating providers to know after your experience in the hospital, what would it be?
Well, it's kind of hard to say because I get calls every single day from medical officials, from VCU and from outpatient care that always checking on me just to make sure I am doing well. I think if that's, I don't know other patients that had this, but if that's consistent across the board, I can't ask for anything more. The help that you guys provide is just amazing. And, I wish we would have went to VCU first versus St. Francis. Um, yeah, I just can't. I can't say that there's something I could say you all should improve. I'm sorry, but if you all give me the same treatment that you give other patients, I think that's all I can ask for.
That's very kind. Thank you so much. And one other thing I was hoping you could share with us is, could you share a little bit about what your life was like before this and how it's different now?
So I think the only biggest difference for me is just the walking. I'm in the banking industry, so I do a lot of walking in the banking industry, and I get a lot of paperwork too that I do. So it hasn't really. I haven't gone back to work yet. I'll go back once all this therapy is done. But that's the only change really. Is just the walking. I can't walk as fast as I normally would walk, and I'm not gonna say I'm working on that because I know what this disease or what this virus can do to me. So I take my time to build that endurance up again when it comes to that. But that's the only really big thing for the most part. It's just the walking. Um, yeah, that's the big thing. Like I could type, I could write. I do have a little shake from it, but that's for muscle strength. So I have tools to help me with that, and they've gotten a lot better. But the biggest thing with me out of this is just the walking and pacing myself. That's really it.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Harris, for sharing with us. I know just from all of us, I want to say how much we appreciate you sharing your story so we can learn from you and learn as we go forward, taking care of more patients. So thank you so much. And I think if you're still available, I hope you can stay. And then at the end, if anybody has questions, we can forward them to you.
Sure.
Okay,
I can stay a little longer.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'd like to transition a little bit from the patient point of view to the physician point of view. And our first speaker who will be sharing with us is Dr. Rose Baumann, third-year resident.
Hey everyone, I'm excited to share my story too, from my perspective. So I'm a third-year internal medicine resident here at VCU. So when I first learned what COVID-19 was, back in January, I was actually out of the country. And on my flight back, I saw a few scattered people wearing masks and I thought they were overreacting. Clearly I had no idea what was to come. Before I knew it, COVID had reached VCU and I was scheduled to start a rotation on CCH3, which has been one of the COVID-19 floors in our hospital. Although I'd rotated on CCH3 many times before, I think my first day on service, I probably was more nervous than my first day of intern year, just really not knowing what to expect. As a resident, I've really had a unique opportunity of seeing multiple aspects of COVID-19 care. So I've rotated through the respiratory illness clinic where I evaluated outpatients and was doing my own COVID swabs. I've also rotated on the general medicine floor where I saw patients get better and learned the nuances of discharging patients home. And then finally, I've also worked in the ICU setting where I've kind of seen the sickest patients and learned the complexity of their care. So I really have multiple perspectives and I think that's kind of unique. So I'd like to share a story about one patient that I took care of that really had an impact on me and I think really reflects well what taking care of patients in the pandemic has been like. So I'm gonna call her Miss K. Miss K was actually my first COVID-19 patient. I took care of her when I was on the general medicine floor on CCH3. However, she was actually an ICU level of care patient. And the reason for this was we were trialing a model to see if floor teams could manage ICU patients kind of for future planning for the pandemic. Now, while this model didn't last long, it was transient, I think it goes to show how different things were on a day-to-day basis, especially when we were first starting out. When I was in that first week on C3, I think we said basically no 2 days were alike, whether it was team structure, number of patients on the team, or even the management of the disease itself. Now, fortunately, we have more of a routine now. So back to Miss K. Before I met her, I learned that she had just recently lost a loved one, a close loved one, to COVID-19. And as I went to enter her room for the first time, there were many thoughts going through my head. Was I gonna do my PPE correctly? If I didn't, does that mean I was gonna get COVID? From what I had heard, this was a very contagious disease and it almost seemed inevitable. And then, this terrible disease that I'd heard about on the news that seemed distant was suddenly just right on the other side of the door in front of me. And on top of all that, I knew she was probably grieving the loss of her loved one, as well as not doing well herself health-wise. And so I really just wondered what I would say to her. Unfortunately, in the days I cared for Miss K, she lost yet another loved one to COVID-19. Communication between our team and her family, as well as between Miss K and her family, was challenging and very limited due to visitor restrictions. Important conversations about her clinical condition, her goals of care, all to take place over the phone rather than in person, which all patients at VCU have been affected by this right now, and even those without COVID. Just families not being able to see their loved ones when they're at their sickest. Unfortunately, Ms. K went on to require intubation and transferred back to the ICU team, and unfortunately she passed away. Now, I hesitated about sharing such a sad story, but I think Ms. K and her family's story really represents the potential tragedy of the pandemic that many unfortunately have experienced. On the other hand, this was not the majority of patients that I have experienced so far. On the general floor, I had the joy of watching patients improve and eventually get to the point where they could be discharged home. Kind of on a closing on a more positive note, I think it's really been a joy to learn about a new disease process with the medical community. It's been pretty exciting and satisfying. It's exciting to enroll patients in clinical trials. As a trainee, everything I've learned before has been taught to me by somebody who has got greater experience than me. But the whole COVID situation is unique in that we're all at all levels of training are really learning and gaining these experiences together. It's exciting to know that the things we're doing now are going to guide management and guidelines in the future. So overall, I think all my COVID patients have really left an impact on me, and I truly feel honored to care for them.
Thank you so much, Rose, for sharing that. And I really appreciate you sharing both kind of the nitty-gritty physician day-to-day perspective along with your personal perspective. I think we can all kind of echo a lot of the feelings you had at the beginning of everything. Thanks. Okay, next up we have our hospitalist extraordinaire, Dr. David Goldberg, sharing his experience.
Hey everybody, so thank you Rose for sharing your story. My story is going to be kind of similar. I'm going to share a story about the shows of how the challenges that caregivers are facing when their loved ones are hospitalized, especially in the setting of COVID-19. So I took care of a patient who was diagnosed with COVID-19. She had many comorbidities. She had high blood pressure, diabetes, some mild dementia, and sorry about that. Was very sick when she came in, to the point where the admitting doctor talked to the husband and said, I think she's going to die within the first 24 hours. So he had that goals of care discussion with her really early on and said, you know, what would you like us to do if her heart were to stop beating or if she wasn't able to breathe on her own? Which is a tough question to ask anybody, but we ask it every time someone comes in the hospital. And he said, I don't want her to have chest compressions. I don't want a breathing tube, but I do want everything else to be done if possible, but no invasive procedures if it gets to that point. So she actually did okay over the first couple days. The following day, you know, her oxygen requirement went down. The doctor who took over for her next said that she actually was able to have a conversation with her, and I was like, oh great, that's really good. And the following day she started getting a little bit worse, and then by the time I saw her, she was not able to have any conversation with me. She was constantly groaning in pain, and we just didn't, I wasn't sure what had happened, but she probably ended up having some delirium. And so I called the husband that day and said, introduced myself and said I was taking over her care, and said, you know, she's not doing well again. I'm concerned that we're moving in the wrong direction. Delirium can happen a lot in the hospital, but you know, she's very sick and just wanted to give you an update. And I asked about what was her baseline like? What was she like before she got sick? And he said that typically she could wheel herself around, feed herself, have a conversation, fairly independent. And this is very different from when I walk in the room. She would constantly groan. It'd be literally 24 hours a day of her just groaning. No matter what we did, no matter what we tried to do, we couldn't calm her down. And so I said, we're going to try some fluids. We're going to try to do the best we can to, you know, we couldn't give to her anything by mouth because she couldn't swallow. And he said, okay, just keep me posted. And the following couple of days, she got worse. She started spiking fevers. She started, her oxygen requirement went up. And it got to a point where I really struggled because sometimes people who have delirium, sometimes we put a nasogastric tube in, give them the medicine they need, give them some nutrition, try to help them right the ship. But in this situation, I did not think she was going to recover, even if we did that. And putting an NG tube in somebody is an aerosolizing procedure, which puts healthcare workers at risk. And it's an invasive procedure for the patient who's already in distress. And so I called the husband. I talked with ethics about this, actually. And ethics agreed that ethically, we did not need to put this NG tube for something that was likely futile. And so I called the husband every day about kind of goals of care, trying to decide if hospice, like focusing on comfort, was something he wanted to go with. And he really struggled, and I don't blame him, because it's a really challenging question to ask when you can't physically be there. And at the time, we were able to bring in families for kind of extraordinary circumstances like end of life. And I said, I know you likely can't make the decision without seeing her. And so the unit was allowed her husband to come in and see her. Within 5 minutes of seeing her, he said, comfort care. And so I'm very grateful that he was able to come in. I'm grateful that that the prior doctors before me kind of set the stage for this conversation. And I just think it's really, and she passed away peacefully in the next couple of days, which I'm grateful that she passed peacefully. And I'm sorry for such a depressing story, but I'm going to try to put a positive spin on part of this. Is that I think people are reaching out to family members, especially those with cognitive issues. Usually, I mean, delirium is a really big problem anytime someone's in the hospital, especially if they have cognitive problems. And now, not having their loved one physically there to say, hey, you're okay, everything's okay, that's taken away. Fortunately, at VCU, we do have FaceTime, where we have phones in the room for a lot of our COVID patients. So he was able to call in, and the few times she got out of this constant groaning, she heard her husband's voice and was like, I love you. So that was pretty powerful. So I just encourage you, if you're a healthcare provider, to reach out to family. Try to get that daily update if you can, especially if the patient can't get that daily update. And everyone stay safe.
David, thank you so much for sharing that really powerful story. I'm having that image in my head of a patient sort of in and out of consciousness, but like what's left is love. And I think that's really beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. Okay, our last storyteller today, we're so honored to have here back again, is Dr. Richard Wenzel.
Thank you very much. And I want to tell Dr. Syme as well as Dr. Lemay, it's a great pleasure for me to be here today and participate in Grand Rounds. So my involvement with COVID-19 has primarily been as an advisor, as an infectious diseases epidemiologist. I've done a number of national webinars and regional ones. And I've also been on a number of epidemics in the past in other countries. So I'd like to begin with the term epidemics. And what I'd like to tell you is epidemics are predictable. They're a normal part of life. And if you just look a little bit back to the 80s, where we had H1N or HIV emerged from Africa, and then 2002 and 3 SARS from southern China, 2009 and 10 H1N1 influenza in Southwest United States and Mexico, and then MERS in 2012, and now COVID. And what you see very quickly is the ineluctable march of epidemics, each with its own consequences. And these are not black swans, totally unpredictable events for which we see major consequences. In fact, they are predictable with the exception of exactly when and exactly how severe. So if you look back at the Albert Camus' story, The Plague, one of the things that the author says is, we've known for a long time that pestilences recur. Yet somehow we seem so surprised by the ones that crash down on our heads from a blue sky. So my first message to you is epidemics are predictable and they're a part of life. Now, if you think about pandemics, the ones I've just cited turn out to be pandemics as well. What we're talking about, according to the World Health Organization, is multiple countries with epidemics and continued transmission. To me, that's a little bit of a vague definition, and it doesn't account for the severity of the pathogen. For example, you could have a pandemic of the common cold virus. And when I was making rounds in ICUs in 2009 in Mexico during their outbreak, the highest peak of their outbreak of H1N1 flu, and then later in 4 countries in South America, I quickly learned something that you wouldn't know if you were waiting around looking at data. The patients weren't the very young and the very old. They were the 20-year-olds. They were all on respirators. And the 2 risk factors, both for being intubated and for dying, were obesity and being pregnant. And I began to think about pandemics. How do we define that better? And I've written about that since. And in my view, what a pandemic is a response to infection that requires international surge capacity. So the international would be underscored and the surge capacity. So I can imagine 3 or 4 grades, if you will, of pandemics, depending on how much surge capacity for medical personnel above and beyond the background of the need for respirators or oxygen or diagnostic kits, or even the percent of GDP required to control it. Imagine if we had these kinds of data on surge capacity required for the last 4 or 5 pandemics, how far ahead we would be. So this to me has meaning and it's operational. So then you say, well, how do we build appropriate surge capacity? And I think what you have to think of is the term robust public health response. And how do we get there, and how do we measure what we're talking about? And for one, I would encourage you to look at a book called The Black Swan by author Nassim Taleb. And one of the things that he says in thinking about risk management, and he uses an example, the Fukushima horrible nuclear power plant disaster in Japan. And he said, you know, this plant was built by the Japanese to withstand the worst earthquake ever seen in Japan, never imagining the 9.0 higher one that occurred. And so what Taleb would say to us, I think, is if you're going to build a robust public health response, don't build it based on the worst epidemic you've seen. Build on one that's even worse than the one you've seen. And then the question is, well, how will we measure our public health responses? And then I think of Abhisthana Bedian, the guru, the father of quality healthcare, and how to measure that. And what he said is, you measure it based on structure, process, and outcomes. So we have to look at our structure for public health response. Do we really have the leadership in place to implement the distribution that we have in the warehouses for storing all the necessary equipment and building the personnel and the supply line? Who in the process will be in charge? Who will be responsible for the supply lines going in and making sure that we really have sufficient responses? And how do we measure our success or failure? I think all of these are important. And so I think also now back to the physician level as well. And again, back to Albert Camus, The Plague. And the protagonist in the story is Dr. Roux. And one of his non-medical colleagues asks him, how do you do this? Every day you get up tirelessly taking care of the wave of patients in front of you. And Dr. Roux, the protagonist, answers, this is not about heroics. And you may find it ridiculous thought, but the only way to fight a plague is with decency. And his colleague says, well, what is decency? And his answer is, doing the right thing and going to work every day. And so when I think about when all of this is over, when we finally get through COVID-19, there'll be much to celebrate about the decency, if you will, the everyday showing up for work of the entire medical team, physicians, nurses, and support teams and colleagues. But along the way, what I would ask you to think about, how did we do as a nation with respect to structure, function, outcome measures, with our preparedness, with respect to the value system that we hold of truth, of empathy, of justice? How did we do as a country? And when I think about empathy, I really like what Dr. Lemay said. I think of Barbara Kingsolver said it's the ability, the capacity to understand that someone else's pain is as meaningful as your own. So I'd like to ask the question, how did we do as a country? And will we be better off for tomorrow's pandemic? Let me stop here and thank you very much for allowing me to give these perspectives, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wenzel, for sharing that sort of historic and expert view of what's going on right now. I really appreciate it. Thank you. I just want to close. I know we just spoke about sort of the difference between heroism and decency. I just want to share a brief story of sort of why I'm viewing my colleagues as heroes right now. Who I believe was the first patient to die of COVID-19 at VCU was actually my primary care patient, who I'll call Mr. V. He was just as lovely as they come, of course. I had taken care of him for 5 years and seen him through probably the darkest days of his life, including waking up one morning to realize that his daughter had stolen all of his money and possessions, and he was suddenly homeless at 80 years old and had just spent the night on a park bench alone before coming to my appointment the next day. He had really had gone through difficult times and stayed at the Healing Place homeless shelter for years before kind of getting back on his feet and finding his church community, which is unfortunately where he picked up his COVID-19. And he was admitted to the hospital. I was worried. It was right at the beginning of the pandemic, and I was worried because he was 80, and I was watching all the statistics coming out of China about people who are 80 and older. But he seemed to be doing very well until the next week when the hospitalist team called me and let me know that he was had turned a corner and was really dying, and was going to be placed on comfort care. And I'm sure any of you who have had patients in this situation kind of had the same worries that I did. I was seeing all of the information coming out of New York and China and Italy about patients dying alone. And that was just my absolute worst fear I could ever imagine, is this man who was over 80 years old, had spent the night alone on a park bench, would die alone. And I was just distraught at the thought of that. And that's definitely not what happened at all. The nursing team, I just want to really thank them incredibly for, they allowed me to FaceTime with him several times, and his whole hospitalist team allowed his fiance to come and be at his bedside when he was dying. And he died just with the best physician, nursing support, and family care that anyone could if someone has to die. So I really just want to thank all of my colleagues who are out there putting themselves at risk fighting this disease. I'm so grateful for you and the care that you provide my patients. And with that, I'll close and take any questions. And thank you so much to all of our storytellers today. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it and how powerful hearing your stories has been. Thank you.
There's a question directed to Dr. Wenzel.
Okay, great. So Dr. Wenzel, there's a question for you. How would you suggest to communicate with people who don't believe in pandemic, but plandemic?
Well, it's very difficult because sometimes these are very rigid people. They're often the same people who are anti-vaxxers, and they have a fidelity to their own issues without being able to see, in my view, the big picture that even those enthusiasts who walked around and really didn't have a mask on and protested, a number of them got sick and a few of them died. So even in the face of tragedy. So what I've heard from people who say, how do you deal with anti-vaxxers or climate change deniers, is you begin to, you try to ask them questions. And so you start any kind of dialogue, but recognize that sometimes there is no dialogue. And it's very frustrating. And I've been involved in that, but I think you do make some headway by not trying to sort of put them down immediately or criticize their beliefs, but in fact, asking the question, what do you see that's good about this or harmful about this in your own opinion? And that's the best that I think I could do right now.
Thank you so much. Agree. It's a very frustrating thing that we're seeing in the community. And I really believe in the power of stories and sharing individual experience. People like that are not going to respond to statistics. So thank you for that. I just want to see if there's any other questions before we close.
This is Patricia. Could I ask a question, please, for Dr. Wenzel? You know, I think the field of public health medicine is obviously sort of pivotal in our response to pandemics, and certainly pivotal in how we're going to plan for the future. And I think it would be really important to understand how we attract people into that field. How do we get some of our brightest and best minds to be interested in the field of public health science so that we're much better positioned for the future? I wonder, with your vast experience, if you could give us some clever thoughts on that one.
Well, by nature, I'm biased, but I think public health is full of adventure. And having spent, even as a medical student, living in a foreign country, the Philippines during an outbreak of cholera, and then living in Bangladesh for a while, seeing the end of smallpox and continuing outbreak of cholera, and then H1N1 in Mexico and several countries in South America, there's an excitement about epidemics and public health that can't be denied. And what I would say that if you expose young people to those adventures, and I used to have this mantra that I think every medical student should take care of people who don't look like them. And you come back from that kind of experience with a totally new perspective that's global, in fact. And so there's the adventure, there's the one-on-one, and I could tell a lot of stories about taking care of an individual cholera patient, you know, where we had 50 or 100 patients a day. But I think exposing people to the adventure themselves when they're young and excited just about everything is sort of the first step. And I'm describing my own involvement, how I got interested in international health and eventually, of course, ID and epidemiology. But thanks for the question.
Thanks, Dr. Wenzel.
Thank you, Dr. Simon, Dr. Wenzel. Dr. Dow posed a question to the panelists. This pandemic has sharpened the focus on the need for physician advocacy. Any advice on how to get our stories heard by the public? I'll chime in just briefly. There are lots of ways to write and have your stories published. Just a couple that I'll mention. Kevin MD is one site where I have written for and been published previously, and sometimes it gets picked up by larger online sources. that you can just submit to freely, and also to consider writing op-eds for newspapers, the Richmond Times-Dispatch, the Washington Post. They're always looking for healthcare providers' perspectives. So those are two pieces of advice I would have about that. I don't know if Dr. Wenzel or anyone else has any additional ideas or input.
Well, I think grand rounds like this is also just perfect way to get some messages out. I've been impressed that people like to watch webinars, and I think that's another one. I totally agree with you about op-eds. It's not easy always to get those in, and those of us who've tried a lot know that you occasionally get some in, and that's wonderful. Any kind of publication, I think, is good. Obviously, a lot of people get their information on social media and as well as television. So we all have different skills, and some people are very good at some way of communicating versus others. So I'd encourage people, go after it.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Wenzel. There's one other question, which I think is directed towards you again. Do you think a possibility of a second wave?
Well, I would put this in perspective. First of all, if there's any year you want to tell anyone in the country to get the flu vaccine, this is it. And you want to have all the medications for influenza and the masks available at very low cost, because this COVID is not going to go away this summer, and it's going to be here in the fall, whether it comes back with a bigger wave or not. But we're going to have a second wave, which is influenza. And I really think CDC should begin to articulate this with a great concern. And on top of that, I just say a couple of other things. It's been reported that 40 to 50% of people who should get their children who should be vaccinated are not getting vaccinated. So imagine flu, COVID, and now little outbreaks of measles around the country on top of that. And what about a natural disaster like some of the hurricanes we've seen, or some kind of earthquake that we just saw? I was not too long ago was in Puerto Rico, where they've just seen, both of those events happen. CDC is going to be highly stressed. And I think what we have to do is be prepared for these waves of both natural disaster, COVID, and influenza.
Thank you so much for that perspective, Dr. Wenzel. And we're right at 1 o'clock, so I think I'll probably close. I just want to give one more thank you to Mr. Johnnie Harris. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your perspective so we can learn. And Dr. Baumann, Dr. Goldberg, and Dr. Wenzel for all sharing your stories. Wishing you all clean hands and good health.
Thank you. A good recovery to Mr. Harris. Thank you. Take care.
Appreciate it.